A pretty outstanding picture here, I tell you. Come on a little bit closer. Okay, here we go, a big one. Off the ground, before. There we go. Much to my surprise, a pair of bunny eyes. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Oh, is this a neat way to travel? Isn't it great? Dum-da-dum-dum-dum. 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 I like to skip along, but me, boy.
The following program deals with a controversial subject. The theories expressed are not the only possible interpretation. Viewers are invited to make a judgment based on all available information. Tonight,
liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We investigate the most extraordinary event of the 20th century.
That's one small step for man.
Man landing on the moon.
One giant leap for mankind.
But believe it or not, some people say it never happened.
What the hell is this, amateur night? Stop him, Harry. Get him off that machine, that isn't a toy. Get out of that moon bucket.
But I think that Buzz Aldrin has to really be one of the real mythbusters, because when Seabrill approached him, shouting at him, "You're a liar, a coward, and a thief." Well, let's show the audience a clip of that.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
And there Buzz Aldrin just clocks him on the spot. How did that feel for a mythbuster?
He's an honorary mythbuster for that.
I'm going to talk to you today about some of the experiences that we had during the Apollo program, particularly landing on the moon. I'm going to try to answer some very important questions. First of all, is the moon made out of green cheese? After we get that weighty question out of the way, we flew to the moon, did a figure eight around it, the trajectory. Next. There was a point in time where it looked like we could not land on the moon. Great consternation in all levels of government. I'll talk a little bit about that next. The first moon landing, and then talk about the moon landing hoax. And I think there's one more. Oh, okay. Is the moon made of green cheese? The answer is? Next chart. No, but what other food item is more appropriate? And the answer is blueberry muffins. Why is that? The moon is not uniform, homogeneous sphere. It has what's called mass concentrations. I thought when we first discovered them in the navigation data that mass cons were made by big iron nickel meteorites, but no, it really was the welling up of heavier rocks to the lunar surface. Next. These lunar mass cons, next, really messed up our orbital navigation, and hence we couldn't land where we wanted to because we couldn't navigate to it. Think of trying to go someplace with a GPS system that's off. If somebody were to say, which mission did we first fly people to the moon? Apollo 11 is the wrong answer. It's Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was really a strategic change in the mission. I failed to mention at the beginning of my talk, you really got to look at the Apollo program and in terms of our competition with the Soviet Union. not only in space, getting the first man into space, getting the first woman into space, getting the first dog into space, being the first ones to be at the moon, you've really got to look at it through the Cold War glasses. We were in a struggle with the Soviet Union. Apollo 8 was not supposed to be a mission that we would fly normally. We had a progression of missions from just putting the Apollo spacecraft into low Earth orbit, to flying the Lunar Module in low Earth orbit, to flying a mission, a dress rehearsal to the moon, but not landing on the moon, and then finally a mission like Apollo 11. But then, I mentioned this briefly, the program was in crisis. The Lunar Module, the craft that landed on the moon, was overweight, underperformed, and was also experiencing a lot of mechanical and electrical anomalies, failures, quality control problems. So it became evident that we didn't want to fly people in the Lunar Module, not yet. And then the CIA raises the question, or challenged us by saying, you know, all our indications from spying on the Soviet Union, they're going to be flying a mission looping around the moon. They're going to beat us to the moon with humans on board. So that really instilled, looking at a mission like this. This is sort of a schematic of the trajectories that we flew to the moon for Apollo 8. We went into low Earth orbit. We did a translunar injection, and we're on a trajectory that we called a free return trajectory. I used to work in a division where we did the mission planning, the analysis. We designed all the trajectories for actually going back to the Mercury program, the Gemini program, and Apollo. Free return trajectory is that if you got on the way flying to the moon and your engines didn't work, instead of going out into deep space or crashing to the moon, it would do a nice figure 8 and return and re-enter in the exact spot will keep you from burning out, because if you come in too steep, you'll burn up. If you go too shallow, you'll skip out into outer space and nobody will see you again. Well, we were dying to find out if we could fly this free return trajectory when all at once a mysterious force comes into play. We looked, something was pushing us around. We couldn't believe it. We kept looking at, we had tracking stations on Earth that were measuring the trajectory of the outbound trajectory with the 3 astronauts on board. Finally, after about a day or so, we came to the conclusion that whenever we dumped the wastewater, thereafter we saw a change in the trajectory. So somehow there was a seeming connection between the two. We looked at the data, confirmed everything, and everybody kept saying, no, the wastewater dump is really a non-propulsive dump. It's a venting of the liquid overboard, and it shouldn't be a problem. What is wastewater? Well, I don't know if you've ever been tenting, been out in the wilderness in a tent, but if you have 3 people in a tent, after a while it gets very humid in there. It's a very clammy, humid environment. You get 3 astronauts inside of a closed spacecraft, and all at once your electronics start shorting out because there's just too much humidity in the air. So you've got to be very careful and squeeze every drop of moisture out of that air. You want a dry air environment. We had equipment on there that removed water from, so wastewater was the water that we were extracting from the cabin, was also the urine that the astronauts generated. So when we dumped the wastewater tank periodically, we were flushing the toilet. So once we knew that flushing the toilet had an effect on our trajectory, the P-dot maneuver was invented. We oriented the spacecraft in the right direction, flushed the toilet, it pushed us back on course. So that's part of the beauty of engineering. One of the things, I'm glad you have a whiteboard here. What's wrong with this? I have a spacecraft here. I have a pipe going out, that's the flushing the toilet out in space pipe. And I have a T in it like this. And so I squirt the fluid out in this direction and that direction. It shouldn't give any force to the spacecraft, should it? Right? A T? What's wrong with that picture? The picture is we are in a hard vacuum of space. When you squirt a little bit of fluid out, that fluid, water, vaporizes into water vapor, right? But also, since it's got a little force to it, it expands. So if you really trace out its trajectory, it expands like crazy, and that makes the pressure on this side of the spacecraft higher than the vacuum of space on the other side. So you've actually got a force pushing sideways. That's why these people that look at the pictures on the moon and they say, oh, the flag is waving or this is happening, they don't understand. You're in a hard vacuum of space. You're also in a 1/6 gravity. But that's just part of the engineering that goes into building and flying spacecraft. Okay, next chart, please. I talked about the Apollo crisis. Next. Lunar Module overweight and underperforming. This went up to the highest levels of government and said, when are we going to land on the moon? The timetable depended on how we were going to solve that problem. Next, please. The Apollo spacecraft program manager, George Low, said that in a review committee meeting, that he would pay up to $30,000 a pound, saving weight in the lunar module to solve this problem. Now, if you can imagine landing on the moon, you need your engines to thrust against the motion of the spacecraft as it's coming down so you can land softly. It's like a parachute. Uses air resistance to get you down to the ground. But if we ran out of propellant fuel before we got down to the lunar surface, we would then drop and crash into the moon. So we wouldn't let that happen. We would abort and jump off with another stage to get back into lunar orbit. But that's a serious problem, aborting the mission with, 100 feet to go, whatever. You don't want to do that. Well, the problem was solved because they gave the problem to me. I had a team of guys, I led a group, and we figured out that it wasn't overweight, it wasn't underpowered. It's just the way we did a lot of computer simulations, we looked at all the hard numbers. We used the actual test data of the rocket engine that was going to, we were going to land with. They took that out into a test stand, they fired it. We had the measured performance. We knew the fuel consumption, the thrust levels, and so forth. So we used that as opposed to using what the contract specification was. Because in the case of the Aerojet engine, they were bound to a contract with the federal government to supply an engine that had certain specifications. So they always wanted to exceed those specifications. So they would Same thing with the weight. Grumman said, well, the spacecraft will weigh no more than this. But we had engineers in the factory as they were building that spacecraft saying, no, it's going to be much lighter than that. So in a way, it sounds like a trivial kind of thing, but we really had to sell the solution. I ended up having to go up to NASA headquarters, briefed Werner von Braun and all the heads of the centers, and von Braun gave me the 3rd degree, but he was an engineer, and he was asking me very probing questions. Anyway, so we got the problem solved. Next. Now, here we are. I've assured everybody we're not going to run out of fuel. Now, on that 20th of July, 1969, this was when we heard the famous words, Houston, the Eagle has landed, and also several hours later when they left the Lunar Module, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But before then, next chart, we had a heart-stopping descent on the moon. Remember I told you about the mass cons? Well, they, instead of landing on this nice smooth area here, had us landing in a boulder field. And Neil Armstrong said, the boulders here are about the size of Volkswagens, a place you would not land. So here he was headed right for this area, a very undesirable area. He couldn't have landed there. So he had to pitch the vehicle. Instead of coming down, he had to pitch it back up to be able to stop his downward descent and to fly further downrange, where he saw a smoother area, got ready to set up to land, and he took over manual control, and all at once, next please, there was a call out that says, low-level light just came on, got 60 seconds before you run out of fuel. My heart was in my mouth at that time. I said, no, it can't be, it can't be. Staked my reputation on it. But Neil was an excellent pilot. I was really overjoyed that they picked him to be the commander on the first landing mission, because I used to be their instructor, the astronauts' instructor. I was very impressed with Neil Armstrong. Anyway, next please. Now, after the landing, we pored over the data, and we still couldn't figure out why is the low-level light coming on. We never really rectified it in our minds. The next mission, Apollo 12, had the same thing happen. We're coming down, the low-level light comes on again. Anyway, we really got serious. Something's wrong. What could be? It can't be some weird thing happened twice in a row. It turns out, and I remember being up at Grumman Aircraft in Long Island, and I was doing a review, and I was telling them about my analysis, and I remember asking them about fuel baffles, fuel tank baffles. And they said, yeah, we got baffles. They assured me, yes, we have. But their concern was a whirlpool effect, so they had anti-swirl baffles, but not slosh baffles. Imagine a bowl of water held in your hand and you move it a little bit, because you are, landing on the moon, you're firing thrusters to keep yourself level. In one gravity, you know, you get a little bit of slosh, but in 1/6 gravity, because you're falling about at a rate that's about canceling the lunar gravity, so you're about 1/6 gravity, that fluid level is going to really slosh as opposed to on the surface of the Earth. So that was the problem. And they did some tests at Langley Research Center in Virginia, and they proved that that's what uncovered the tank. I mean, we had the fuel in the tanks, but as you know in a car, if your light starts coming on, you need to do something about it. Next chart. Well, I could tell you another funny story about this. I really ended up saving them 800 pounds of weight. They didn't have to spend the $30,000 to get, and one of the guys that worked for me said, hey, you know, they got an incentive award program. You got to turn, you know, you save the government millions of dollars. Well, it turns out that they will pay you to a reward 10% of how much you save the government. Well, it turned out that I would have made 1.2, well, I did turn in the paperwork, I think, $1.2 million. I got this nice letter back, and they said, thank you for your submission. That was a great job you did, but you don't understand what the incentive award is, or the employee suggestion award, or whatever they call it. They said, if you had been working in the mailroom, and at night you woke up in a dream and said, oh, they ought to do this and do that and everything, and save that $800, 800 pounds, I mean, then you would have got the $1.2 million. But you were just doing your job. That's what you're paying you $500 a month for. So anyway, that's kind of funny. Now, the lunar landing hoax, this is really something that I really bristle at, but I have a theory. Why the public is skeptical about this. They have done polls, interviews, and so forth, and the American public is essentially sitting around 15 to 20%. There's maybe a smaller percentage that knows that it's a hoax and we never landed, but another larger group is skeptical, doesn't know whether we did or didn't, isn't sure that we really landed on the moon. That's the way it is. I mean, 20% is a lot of people. In the US, Europe is about the same, but you go to third world countries in Africa, I mean, they don't believe you at all. They don't believe that man ever walked on the moon. Next. I believe the story started from the crappy live video on the moon. And the reason I say that is the day after landing, I was home at night with my family watching it on television. I'm sure there's maybe one or two here old enough to remember seeing it. But the real-time video was slow scan, very low resolution. The movement of the guys in front of there was streaky because it was slow scan, just low, terrible resolution, black and white. And part of that was caused, strangely enough, because the flight plan, after the crew landed, they were supposed to sleep for a couple hours. Can you imagine the wisdom there of telling them, okay, you've landed on the moon, go sleep for a few hours and then you can get up. So the crew pleaded with ground control and said, we're ready to go out there, damn the sleep. And so that was all well and good, except part of this is a choreographing of the Earth and the moon and the rotation of the Earth. Well, our prime deep space dish was the Goldstone tracking system, which was the part of the Deep Space Network. There was an auxiliary station down in Australia that could see, if they went out early, that the station could see and receive telemetry and so forth, but it couldn't process the television signal, the real-time TV, because they couldn't get it onto the US network, where Goldstone is in California, and they could easily pump it into the NBC, CBS, and so forth. So they actually had the video from the moon, and they took another camera and put it on there and pumped it to the US. So you can imagine the degradation of the quality. So anyway, I'm getting away from my story, and the story is that when I went into work, some of my guys had been over to the press center. We had this big building with all these reporters from all over the world. And not only just reporters of TV and print, but also famous authors and luminaries in the system. Norman Mailer was there as an example. So our guys came back and they said, guess what the Italian press corps is saying? And I said, oh, you tell me. They said that we didn't land on the moon, that it was actually a Hollywood studio that was putting this stuff out. And we all kind of laughed, and then I thought to myself, you know, that's not such a ridiculous idea. From the crappy video I saw, you could have had Howdy Doody on there, and people wouldn't really recognize him all that much. So I think that got the seed planted. Days later, when they brought the the 70 millimeter Hasselblad color stills that were just absolutely beautiful, I think people were prepped to say, okay, let's see if we can figure out if this is a phony or not. They saw a C on one of the rocks. Ah, that's a giveaway. People are not painting C's on rocks on the moon, are they? It was a mistake. Well, it turns out it was somebody's eyelash that was on the photo negative in the color processing. Really, when you talk about a moon hoax, you're talking about a conspiracy theory. Now, somewhere around 300,000 or 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program. Could be people manufacturing the screws that went into the spacecraft or whatever. But probably the people that were in there firsthand at the Cape Canaveral in Houston, at the tracking stations and everything, many thousands and thousands of people. How do you fool that many people? And nobody has confessed and said, you know, we really did this. Now, I want to digress a minute. During an earlier mission, space mission called Gemini, I was literally involved in a UFO cover-up because, you know, I know firsthand we do those kind of things. But here, I don't think so. I'll tell that story some other time if you want. So the theory is, of those who are proponents of the moon hoax, that a small group of people in the know, the luminaries of the space business, the White House, the federal government and so forth, they're the ones that faked all this, and us peons in Mission Control Center and looking at the data are being fooled by simulated data. Which is really kind of a laughable hypothesis. Next. Now, I told you about the fuel slosh problem. We flew 2 missions with the fuel slosh problem. If we didn't fly to the moon, and we discovered later by tests in the laboratory that the fuel sloshed, these people were not only good simulators of space missions, but they were also psychic, that they could foretell the future, that they could tell, I see in the future fuel sloshing in the tanks. It's going to throw things off. It's going to call out the 60-second warning too soon. Now, I got this is my last chart. Thank you for bearing with me. I'll give you some potpourri. In September 1968, by the way, we flew Apollo 8 around the moon in December of '68. The Soviets in 1968 did the same sort of thing with a Soviet spacecraft, and they flew live biological samples on board, including a pretty good-sized tortoise. Flew around the moon and back. That was a prelude to them flying the Apollo 8 mission that the CIA knew about, that let us know, and we followed a couple months later in December of '68 and flew around the moon. One tortoise, but they also had some other fish eggs, and I can't recall what else. But they wanted us, you know, the effect of spaceflight has never been totally understood until we flew some long duration missions like Skylab, and the Russians flew a space station also. Well, that's true. Why not rats? Yeah, I know. I don't know why they picked a tortoise. During the time we flew, in July of 1969, the same time that we were flying to the moon in deorbit, and we had 3 men in the vicinity of the moon, the Soviet Union launched, and also with the intention of bringing lunar soil samples back. They let us know almost at the last minute, hey, we've got this, we're going to avoid you, and so forth. And that came as a real shocker. But their system failed, and instead of their lander landing on the moon, scooping up some soil and bringing it back, it smashed into the lunars. So their sneaky little attempt was rewarded. I'll tell you, really, really pissed off a lot of us in Houston when we found out about that. Yes, next one. I mentioned that I had solved the weight problem on the lunar lander, but there were a lot of people that didn't want to fly the real-time video on the lunar lander for a number of reasons. It was a heavy system, but I said you could fly it because we had the weight margin. But also, whenever you fly a piece of equipment that astronauts have got to operate, you've got to make sure they know how to operate it. I mean, how many times have you pulled a camera or a cell phone or whatever out of the box and, you know, been bewildered by it? We don't want that to happen. We've got to train them so that they know how not only to operate it normally, but to operate it in case it fails. So there was a meeting where the recommendation out of the meeting from all the experts, flight crew training, real-time mission operations, this and that and so forth, the recommendation unanimously was don't fly the real-time video camera on the lunar module. My boss's boss was Chris Kraft, who was head of flight operations. He said, wait a minute, guys. Imagine we're a film crew on the shores of whatever the island Christopher Columbus landed on. We could take pictures of, you know. Okay, it's black and white, slow scan, but we could at least see them coming, planting the Spanish flag on the shore. We've got to, you know, I think cooler heads prevailed during that time. So that's the end of my story, and I'm sticking by it.